Hi, and welcome back. So today we're going to talk about intelligence testing and also the testing of adaptive behavior. Two related and important topics when we think about identifying children who may be eligible for special education services, and also when we think about the impact of certain types of skills and behaviors on children's academic performance. So let's start out first by talking about what is intelligence and how does it differ from or relate to adaptive behavior. Well, intelligence is what we consider to be an individual's general mental capacity. A simple way of putting it is we tend to think of intelligence as a measure of how smart you are. It's a very difficult thing to define, though. It includes things like reasoning, planning, solving problems, thinking abstractly, comprehension, and the rate of learning. In other words, how quickly you learn, how you retain that learning and apply it to new situations. Those are all easy words to say, but relatively hard things to think about ways of measuring. So if you were, for example, to think about, well, how am I going to measure someone's intelligence through this thing called reasoning? What are some of the things that I'm going to do that? Can you think of a question or an activity or an observation that you might make that would help you determine the level of someone's reasoning skills? Not just whether or not they could reason, but whether their ability to reason was somehow better than someone else's ability to reason. It's a tough task. In general, when we think about measuring intelligence, we're really talking about looking at things that are related to or reflective of your scholastic aptitude, because intelligence is important to us as a construct, because it has a very strong link to your academic success. Simply put, smarter people or people who have higher levels of measured intelligence tend to do better in school than those who have lower measured intelligence. Adaptive behavior, on the other hand, rather than an aptitude that you might have for learning, adaptive behavior is the degree that you have of personal independence and social responsibility. So those two things, personal independence and social responsibility, are very much age-related kinds of skills. Our expectations about your level of independence, for example, differs if you're a 4-year-old versus if you're a 40-year-old. What we expect you to be able to do to display that independence will be very different for those two ages, as well as social responsibility. Again, what would you expect a 4-year-old to do that would be reflective of their social responsibility? One example might be that a 4-year-old would understand or be able to respond to a peer who had hurt themselves and was crying, that they would do something to try to comfort that individual already by the age of 4. And social responsibility for a 40-year-old might look very different. It might include things like whether you voted or not, whether you do work or volunteer work in your community, whether you help your neighbor out when they need some help mowing the lawn or raking the leaves, that kind of thing. So adaptive behavior is something that changes based on your age, where we tend to think of intelligence as something that is an aptitude that you have. It can change, it can grow, according to our current theories, but it's not so much something that changes because of age. It changes more because of opportunities to learn. So adaptive behavior are behaviors that basically allow us to survive and function. When I think about adaptive behavior, I think about functional skills, things that you do to take care of yourself. You stop before you cross the street. You know how to read signs that tell you to yield to traffic, or which bathroom is the right bathroom to go to, and you know how to read the signs of the world around you. Not written signs per se, but you know better than to walk down a dark alley in a bad neighborhood. for example. So taking precautions that ensure your safety and survival in the world, and that includes whether you brush your teeth every day. That's another example of an adaptive behavior. So, adaptive behavior is more practical aptitude, the strength of your ability to take care of yourself in practical kinds of ways, versus intelligence, which reflects scholastic aptitude, that ability to learn and apply what one learns to other kinds of challenges, particularly academic challenges. So let's start by taking a closer look at IQ. What does IQ mean? Well, we know intelligence quotient is what the IQ stands for. But IQ itself is basically the first thing to think about when we talk about IQ is that it's simply a test score. And for us, we understand that a Q score is it has a mean of 100 and typically a standard deviation of 15. So we could all tell what an average IQ score was. For example, that would be 100. We would know what a high IQ score was or a low IQ score relative to that mean. It's also a relationship between measured mental age, MA, and chronological age. So the early formula for computing an IQ was to take your mental age, divide it by your chronological age, and multiply that by 100. And that's something that works very well when we're talking about young children or people that are developmentally under the age, let's say, of 21. Um, so basically, the thought would be if your mental age is 5, as measured by some kind of test, and your chronological age is 5, and we take that one and divide by the other and multiply it by 100, your IQ is going to be 100. And you could do the math with some other different ages and mental ages and chronological ages to see how that plays itself out. Today we prefer the test score, based on the statistical kinds of things that we've talked about before, that produce for us on a bell-shaped curve a mean of 100 and that standard deviation of 15. It's a much more accurate measure, particularly when we're talking about adults. It's also, if we think about it as a test score, which is really what it is, IQ by itself, your intelligent quotient is a measured score. Your intelligence is something different, however. It's something that we try to measure. How much of it do you have? And basically, what we do is we're measuring it by the way you respond, or the student that we're giving a test to responds to a set of stimuli at a specific point in time. We give someone a test that we have determined to be a test of intelligence, and whatever they score on that test is considered to be their IQ, their intellectual quotient, their intellectual capacity, their ability to learn as compared to others. That's the problem, because intelligence is something that we can infer by giving people tests of things, but it's not something that we can directly see. And I'd just take a few minutes, pause this for a minute, and think about for yourselves, what does intelligence mean to you? If you're a teacher, for example, how do you know, and I'll guarantee that you know it, how do you know that some of the kids in your room are more intelligent or more capable intellectually than other children in the room? Who's your smart kids and who are your less smart kids? And how do you know that? Because we all think we do. And what tests are trying to do when they're trying to capture an IQ score is they're trying to define what it is that makes one person be perceived of as more intelligent than another person. In fact, here's really kind of a visual representation of what intelligence tests and samples of behaviors really mean. If you think about the large oval itself being what we would call intelligence, whatever that is. It's kind of this amorphous blob, right? It's big, it's all encompassing. Must include lots of different factors, but we only have ways of creating tests that measure some sample of whatever that larger blob is. So you can see on your screen that there's a long blob that represents one intelligence test. And over to the left of your screen, there's another smaller blob that represents another type of test. Test A, maybe we've got then some long ovals, one representing test B, one representing test D, and then another vertical oval, test C. And there's some overlap among all of these measures. So the test A has some of the same kinds of items on it as test E does. And so forth. You can kind of see how that overlap looks on the screen, but none of them actually are the same size or anywhere near the same size as what this big blob is that we call intelligence. We know it exists, and we know it takes certain forms, and our tests are designed to try to capture something about that bigger blob. And really, they capture only a small sample of what that bigger blob might be. Some are better than others at sampling behaviors. Some are poorer than others at sampling behaviors. So let's think a little bit about what some of the kinds of behaviors are, or the stimuli that are sampled by intelligence tests. Because remember, it's just intelligence as we can measure it is just a person's reaction to a given set of stimuli at a certain point in time. So if we look at intelligence tests, and you'll see some descriptions of these types of stimuli in your textbook. It's your ability to discriminate between objects. It's your ability to sequence things. So what comes first, what comes next, what comes last, or putting colored beads together in a particular sequence. Generalization, taking the ability to take one thing that you've learned and apply it to other situations. Detail recognition, which might be measured by your ability to pick out what a whole object is, only being given a small detail of it, or vice versa. Motor behaviors, some motor behaviors are reflective of intelligence in our thinking. Analogical reasoning, this goes to this as this goes to this. You've probably all had tests like that. General knowledge, how much you know about the world. Pattern completion, vocabulary, abstract reasoning, oops, error on the slide, should say reasoning, induction, and memory, and finally comprehension. So think about a couple of the items that are here. General knowledge being one. Where does general knowledge come from? Is that something that you're born with, or is something that you acquire over time? I would argue that it's something you acquire over time. So there is one of those items that are it's definitely linked to your academic experiences. Similarly, vocabulary is linked to your experiences, not necessarily a measure of something that we might want to call innate intelligence. It's hard to put a finger on what is innate intelligence. So here's some alternative views of intelligence and the assessment of intelligence. We start out first of all with Binet, and Binet and his colleagues Spearman and Simon were the early pioneers of intelligence theory and intelligence assessment, starting at the beginning of the 20th century. So their theory was a single theory of general aptitude. It was the beginning of people's talking about something called the G factor. The G factor being general aptitude or intelligence. essentially. And that G factor, that sort of unified or single theory, has been applied to many other iterations of intelligence theory and intelligence assessment. So they set out to develop tests that would enable us to tap into that general aptitude that a person had. And as you saw from some of the items on the earlier slide, those aptitudes are very often reflective of learned behaviors, as opposed to this thing that they believed in, which was some innate kind of ability in a person that enabled them to demonstrate those kinds of skills. So they were looking for items that would enable them to discriminate uh, against, really literally at the time, against people who didn't have those abilities. And they were looking for what at the time were called feeble-minded people. And in doing so, they were trying to, well, Benet's goal was to try to identify individuals who might need more help in school or who might belong in classes for people who were less capable. But others had some more nefarious kinds of reasons for developing the early tests. If you take a look at the video that I have on Moodle for you this week, you'll see some examples in the first video of how intelligence testing has been used against people over the years as a way of sorting out desirables from undesirables. Gardner is probably a name that you're familiar with. His concept was that rather than a single theory of general aptitude that would reflect who is intelligence versus who is lesser intelligent, he believed that there were multiple kinds of intelligences. He called them the seven, he believed that there were seven intelligences: linguistic intelligence, logical mathematical intelligence, spatial intelligence, musical intelligence, body kinesthetic intelligence, movement kinds of intelligence, if you will, interpersonal intelligence, and intrapersonal intelligence. So, in other words, he thought that intelligence was something that could be displayed in a number of kinds of ways. And if you look back over that list of the seven intelligences that Gardner talks about, most of them are very difficult to measure. And most of our tests really focus in primarily on the linguistic components of Gardner's ideas about intelligence and the logical mathematical components of his ideas of intelligence. Then we have the Cattell-Horn-Carroll theory, or the CHC theory, that if you had to do the Woodcock-Johnson 3 or 4 as your assessment critique, and if that's the test that you're using to do your assessment of a student, you're pretty familiar with the Cattell-Horn theory at this point in time. Their theory was that there are three strata of intelligence, if you will. One strata is an overarching one that encompasses everything else, and that is known as the G factor. So they're going back to believing that there is this general aptitude that can be measured, but you can also dissect that G factor into specific abilities, which they called broad abilities, and then very specific abilities, which were what they call narrow abilities. So we have this G factor, whatever that is, this sort of single theory that there is a general aptitude. And then breaking it down, we have different types of G's, a different breakdown of G's. So we have, for them, there was comprehension knowledge as one G factor, long-term retrieval as another G factor, visual processing as a third G factor, auditory processing as the fourth, fluid reasoning as the fifth, short-term memory as the sixth, and then finally the seventh broad factor of G was processing speed. So they attempted to identify and develop specific subtests for the tests that they created that would give further, more detailed information about each of these G factors, and or these broad G's, if you will, that are under that G umbrella. So they came up with narrow ability kinds of subtests. Things like looking at comprehension and knowledge, for example, they were talking about language development, they were talking about lexical knowledge, and then general verbal information, how much you know. And that those three sort of narrow measures came under the heading of comprehension and knowledge. And they did the same thing for the other types of G factors that they felt were part of this general G thing. So, for example, if you look at the Woodcock-Johnson, you will see that the subtests, when you give the cognitive component of that test, the subtests fit into one of 7 categories, and they in fact yield scores within each of those categories, which gives you a pattern of a student's relative strengths and weaknesses on each of those separate or broad G factors. So that was their contribution, and that is probably the most widely used theory today, I think, in terms of the measurement of intelligence. The one I like, however, is the concept of dynamic assessment. That's a concept that takes us back to Vygotsky, whose idea was that that intelligence was not just what you were able to demonstrate at a given moment in time on whatever measures or specific skills that we choose to look at. His idea was that a better measure of intelligence was how much you were able to learn about that specific skill in the context of being tested. So the idea behind that is that you might give an individual a particular item. Let's take a simple item like making a block pattern. So you're given a set of blocks of different colors. Let's say the blocks are red and white. So they're solid red on some surfaces of the block, solid white on other surfaces of the block, and perhaps half white and half red on other surfaces of the block. And you are directed to put them together to form a pattern that matches a picture card that you get to look at. And you've probably all seen something like that. Well, his idea was if you gave a student that particular type of a stimuli and they had a difficult time with it, that is one measure of where they're at independently. Then if you take the time to try to teach the student that skill, to teach the student how to do that block pattern, and they are able to, with various levels of assistance, if you're a special ed teacher, you might think of that as levels of prompts. If you were able to then complete that task successfully, that is a better measure of your intellectual capacity or potential. It's reflective of your ability to learn in the moment. We call it the zone of proximal development. So his concept was, with dynamic assessment, you get an idea of just how wide a person's zone of proximal development might be. So take any given group of individuals, all of whom start out, let's say, at this level on a given set of assessments of something like intelligence. And then you give all of those same individuals the opportunity to learn that task. You will find that some individuals will be able to grow this much in terms of what they can do on the task. Others might grow this much in terms of what they're able to then do with the task, and others might grow as much as this in terms of what they're able to do on the task. And so that's a measure of intelligence. The ones who can only grow this much are less capable in terms of that task of learning than ones who are able to grow this much. These people have a larger ZPD. And I think that that's a good way to think about assessment if we're thinking about it from the standpoint of special education, because really our dedication is to try to take people from where they are struggling and provide them with the appropriate kinds of assistance that will help them achieve at an even greater level. So it's what can you do with the right kinds of assistance that is a better measure of how what your aptitude for learning is. And you can read more about that if you want to read Vygotsky, or there's even a little bit about it in the book. So now we have, what are the general issues in measuring intelligence? Because I have to say, as hard as it is to talk about what intelligence is and to define it in a way that can be measured, it's a very controversial issue, and there's been over 100 years of debate about what intelligence is and how we should measure it, and then more importantly, what we should do with those measures. And that one of the YouTube videos that I've put on Moodle for you this week will give you a sense of what some of that debate is all about. It's a very interesting and entertaining video, so I urge you to take a look at it. What is the debate about? Well, the first part of the debate starts with, what are we going to do with these measures of intelligence? Do we look at a person after we've measured them and say, well, this defines who they are. This person measures lower on a scale of intelligence, and therefore their potential is less. Or this person measures higher on a scale of intelligence, and therefore their potential is greater. How do we view intelligence? Do we view it as a fixed factor, or do we view it as something that can be changed? And if it can be changed, what do we do to change it? Well, originally we saw intelligence as a fixed factor, that it was who you were. So if we measured your intelligence, we used IQ testing to really put a limit on you, to place you somewhere that reflected your low level or high level of ability to learn. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Then we looked at, as part of the controversy, if we see it as something that's fixed, that means it's something that you're born with, right? It's innate, that intelligence is an innate part of you, and it can't be changed. So whatever it is that I use to measure your intelligence, assuming I've chosen the right kind of stimuli, I have a sense of your limitations, if you will. That's looking at, if it's innate, it's part of your genetic makeup. It's the way that you're born. Some of us are born smart, and some of us are born not so smart. That's just who you are. For a long time, that was the belief about intelligence testing. And again, it was used to separate people out into categories. And then we began to think about the benefits of experience and how it interacts and transacts with the notion of intelligence. So how does your experience over time affect or impact your measured, and remember, I'm talking about measured or tested intelligence, because I don't know how to talk about intelligence any other way. None of us are really sure what it is. We just know it exists. So can experience affect your measured level of intelligence? So if you start out having a low IQ score, can we change that through experience so that we can make it a higher IQ score. And likewise, if you start out with a generally good IQ score, can experience have a negative effect on that. And in fact, what we have found out over time, as that debate has gone on, it's not just about nature, it's not just about what you're born with, and it's not just about experience. It's not just about the experiences that you have growing up. It is an interaction or a transaction between those two things, that your measured intelligence is a product of both your genes and your experiences. And there's been numbers of studies that have demonstrated that. Early on in the 20s, for example, there was the Milwaukee Project that showed that young children in poverty whose intelligence whose tested levels of intelligence, I want to keep emphasizing that, whose tested levels of intelligence were relatively low as compared to their more fortunate peers. They took these kids and their parents who were impoverished, and they placed the kids early on, as very young, from birth pretty much on. They were high-risk kids in high-risk families. They placed them in quality children's care facilities, quality preschool experiences, and at the same time they began to educate the caregivers, their parents, in terms of how to interact with them, how to be good parents, if you will. And they did a lot of other things to help the families out. They got them jobs, they made sure that the children were appropriately fed, and so forth. It was a lengthy and costly experiment. But as a result of that experiment, we learned that IQ, as we can measure it, could be changed such that we saw significant gains in IQ scores on these children that received these services with their families, as compared to matched children who had not received those services. We see it also in Head Start. Head Start has demonstrated time and time again that a quality program can improve children's IQ scores on a test by as much as 15 points. What we've also discovered is that that's not likely to last unless those good school experiences last, and that seems to be a challenge as well. So the bottom line is, what we've found out is that you bring a certain amount to the table, but what you bring to the table can be greatly affected by the experiences that you have. So intelligence is malleable. And again, I want to emphasize the flip side of that is true as well. You might bring a lot to the table in terms of your genes, but in a series of negative, non-nurturing experiences, the impact will be a depression in measured IQ. So genes and experiences, nature and nurture, are a transactional process in terms of how people score, again, on intelligence tests. Another issue in terms of measuring intelligence is that there is a great deal of evidence that there is an ethnic, linguistic, and cultural bias in the methods that we choose to measure your supposed innate abilities. Of course, as we've seen from many of the tests that we've looked at, tests are biased to begin with against people who have not had the experience of the kinds of items that are on the test. And when it comes to language and to culture, IQ tests are particularly a culprit in bias against an individual. I'm going to talk in a minute about some of the legislation that demonstrates what that looks like, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it now. But there is tremendous evidence that the inherent bias in our ways of measuring intelligence has caused a lot of over-identification of problems with intelligence in populations that are ethnically, linguistically, and culturally different from the westernized norm. And then finally, a major issue in terms of measuring intelligence is the belief still that your IQ um, represents who you are and thus results in a label that says something about you that may result in lower expectations for you. So let me talk about that in terms of litigation and how that has really affected us. In terms of litigation, there's just three cases that I want to talk about. Two that primarily have been argued in California, so they pertain especially to you and to your experiences of school. And the other is a case that's not a California case, but it does represent how the court system can lead to differences in how we look at things. The first court case, probably the most famous one, is Larry P. versus Riles. Riles was the state superintendent of schools in California. So that Larry P. is a California case. And I have the dates 1979, 1984 up there. It's a case that has been brought up over and over again. And in fact, the initial case of Larry P. versus Riles actually began in 1970, 1972. So it's reappeared and reappeared, and 79 and 84 were some of the later. And I believe it actually was continued to be argued even after 1984 on some other kinds of issues. Originally, Larry P. versus Riles was brought on behalf of African American children who had been placed into segregated classes in special education for what was then the label EMR. EMR at that time, it's back in the 70s, it's not a correct term anymore, but EMR referred to the educable mentally retarded. So back in the 70s and prior to the 70s, we had three levels of individuals with cognitive impairments. The first level were those who were considered to be educable. Educable meaning that you could benefit from a academic education, but you would the expectation about you was that you would benefit from it at a lower level and that you would need it to be presented to you at a slower pace. So in our special ed classes for EMR children, you had children who were learning their ABCs and addition and your 3 R's basically, but they were getting a watered down version of that curriculum, and they were getting it presented to them at a much slower pace. We also had at that time classes for children who were considered trainable. So we had TMR classes, and those individuals were individuals with cognitive impairments who we felt would not benefit from a academic education, but would benefit from an alternative kind of education, which would include things like vocational training and life skills training. So we have a similar kind of version of that today. We just don't call them the children by those labels, EMR and TMR. We have children who are considered to have a disability and who have an IEP, who are in classes where they're getting academic skills, they're on the diploma track. And then we have children who are considered to be lower functioning in terms of their cognitive development, who are on an alternative curriculum. So you're all probably aware of that. The third population of cognitively impaired individuals that we had back then were the severe and profound individuals with severe and profound levels of mental retardation. And they were lucky if they got school. And we had something called development centers back then, which were basically babysitting environments that for a time parents actually paid fees to the schools to be able to send their children to these environments if they weren't in an institution The likelihood was, however, was high that someone with the label of severely and profoundly retarded would be in an institution. So back to Larry P. Children in educable mentally retarded classrooms, or EMR classrooms, were on public school campuses, but they were typically in a special day class kind of setting that was designed for students with that label. Now, Larry P. was brought because of what was called a disproportionate, suspect relationship between the number of African American children who were in California schools at the time versus the number that were in these segregated classes for children with mental retardation. So, just to give you an example of what that meant, at the time that Larry P. was first brought in 1972, the population of African American children in schools in California, so reflecting all schools in California at that time, the population was approximately 18% African American. In classes for educable mentally retarded children, however, the percentage of children from African American descent was around 65%. So 18% in the general population, but 65% in these classes for children who were EMR. That seemed pretty significant. So the case was brought, and the courts looked at it very seriously, and they were asking basically three questions. The big question is, how come there's so many African American children in these classrooms? And to answer that big question, they asked three specific questions. The first question was, is there just something about these African American children such that they are just generally inferior to their Caucasian peers and just generally less intelligent? And so that's why they are in these classrooms. That's where they belong. They're not as smart as their Caucasian peers. That was a question that the courts asked, and there was a great deal of testimony about that, and a lot of several people who were professors at the time in California lost their jobs over this particular argument because of their stance on it. The courts looked at a great deal of evidence, and in fact what they determined in looking at this evidence was that there was no fundamental difference in ability or potential between African American children and their Caucasian peers. In other words, that they did not reflect some kind of an inferior class or some kind of a group that could not learn as well. That was their first decision. So their second question related to this larger one of why are so many African American children in these EMR classrooms, the second question they asked was, is it because so many of these children are living in poverty? And so they looked at that. Now, one of the reasons, or the way that children got into EMR classrooms, I want to go back and point this out. Children got into EMR classrooms to begin with because of their scores on a single IQ test. A single test of intelligence is what it took to be placed in these EMR classrooms. And on average, children from African American backgrounds were scoring 15 points lower than their typical peers, their Caucasian peers, on these IQ tests, and thus they were qualifying for placement in these EMR classrooms. So we've ruled out that they're not inherently less intelligent, and that's not why they're scoring lower. The second question is, are they scoring lower because most of them live in poverty? And poverty is an explanation for poor performance on an IQ test. And in fact, what the courts found, again, lots of testimony and evidence, the courts found that it wasn't because of poverty alone. That if you separated Caucasian and African American children out into subgroups based on their poverty level, African American children who were considered at or below the poverty level were scoring 15 points lower on IQ tests than Caucasian American children who were also below the poverty level. So, okay, middle class African American children in general scored 15 points lower than their Caucasian peers who were middle class. And upper class African American or upper income African American children also scored 15 points lower on average than their upper income level Caucasian peers. That was interesting. The 15-point IQ difference held across all economic strata. So that wasn't the answer. So the third question and final question that the courts asked about this was, is there something wrong with the test? Well, it took them a long time to get to that question, but they did finally answer it, and they very carefully and with lots of expert testimony examined the IQ tests that were in use in that time. And the courts in California found that the IQ tests had bias that was significant and was significantly against African American children. That there was bias in these tests that accounted for this 15-point difference in IQ. So therefore, the courts said, you can no longer use these IQ tests to place African American children into classes for the EMR child. Can't use these tests. If you want to use some other kind of test to place children, then we must approve of those tests. And you must hold public hearings. And the public must approve of your use of those tests. Well, that wasn't going to happen. So essentially what happened, and the courts also said, every child, every African American child that is currently placed in a classroom for EMR children must be re-examined without using these tests and redetermined to see if they qualify for these classes. We didn't have any substitute tests at the time or any substitute mechanism for reclassifying these students, so many of them wound up back in the general ed population. Well, that was the problem, because going back to low expectations based on low test scores, EMR classrooms were classrooms with lower expectations for children than general ed classrooms were. So we took a large group of children out of these EMR classrooms and put them back in the general ed environment when they weren't ready for it. They had not been instructed at a level that was appropriate to those classrooms, and they still failed. That's why you see 1979 and 1984 up there also as dates for Larry P. The first decision being you cannot use these IQ tests to place African American children into classes for the EMR. Wiped out the use of IQ tests for that population. 1979, now a lot of these kids had gone back into the gen ed classroom where they continued to have difficulties. And at that time we were beginning to develop classes for learning disabled children. And how did you get into those classes? IQ tests. And so these children, these same African American children, began to be placed into segregated special ed classes for children with learning disabilities. So Larry P. was brought up again, and again in 1984 for placement in other types of special ed classrooms. The essential message was, by the end of all of this litigation, that IQ tests could not be used as a way of placing African American children into any kind of special education classes. It could not even be used as one of the measures for that kind of placement. So in California, we don't use IQ tests to place African American children into special ed classes. And in many schools, we don't use IQ tests at all because of all the court controversy around the use of these tests. Now, Pace versus Hannon, which is settled finally around 1980, was brought on behalf of African American children as well. It was in the Chicago schools, however. And the court there came to very somewhat different conclusions and a very different outcome. They too asked similar questions of the Larry P. case, but they examined the IQ tests that were used at that time, item by item. The judges actually went through each item on those tests and identified specific items that they felt were biased against African American children. But they said, even though there is that kind of bias in these tests, and the best thing would be to eliminate these questions, because the law, now we had 1974, we had Public Law 94-142, the first Education for All Handicapped Children Act, which is now IDEA. We had a law now that said we must have multidisciplinary assessments and multimodal assessments. In other words, use multiple tests and multiple people as part of the assessment process for placement in special education. So in Chicago, for the Pace case, they said that the Chicago schools could continue to use IQ tests as one of the measures for placement, but it could only be used as part of a multiple battery of tests for placement. So in other places in this country, IQ tests are still used as part of the placement process, but not in California. And then finally, Diana versus the State Board of Education, 1970, right around the time Larry P. was happening, was brought on behalf of students who had been placed in special education classrooms on the basis of IQ tests in English when they were English language learners. And the courts determined that that was an inappropriate use of tests as well, and said that we could not use IQ tests in English to place bilingual or English language learners in special education programs. So essentially, again, it kind of wiped out the use of these sorts of tests. And Diana extended beyond IQ testing. It also applied to the use of verbal tests, any kind of verbal tests in English for special ed placement. The law's been a little bit circular around that, if you want. The federal law says that tests must be given in a student's native or home language to the maximum extent feasible. So our federal law does allow for the use of verbal tests in English for special ed placement, but only as one measure. Other things need to be taken into consideration as well. So you can see what happened with IQ testing in particular was that children were misplaced, or if not misplaced, overplaced in classes, all kinds of special ed classes, on the basis of these tests, and of these tests as a sole measure for their placement, when many of the tests themselves have been proven to be biased against particular populations. So that's been the biggest controversy, I think, around IQ testing. So currently, what do? Well, IQ testing remains controversial because of the way it was inappropriately used in the past for placement in special ed. And even before we had special education, it was used to put people in institutions. IQ testing was used to, on Ellis Island, for example, to determine who could come into this country, who was desirable versus who wasn't. And people actually would get sent back to their home country because they couldn't pass these initial IQ tests, which were mostly in English. Um, IQ tests remain part of the assessment process, however, in most places in this country. And actually, part of our assessment process, even in California, it limited to certain minorities, of course, but with other people, we continue to use IQ tests as part of the assessment process. Some of the IQ tests have gotten better. The Woodcock-Johnson cognitive, for example, is considered to be a better measure than some of the others that have been used in the past. But if you look at it, it too is closely related to Western middle class experience in terms of the kinds of items and in terms of the kinds of skills that are being assessed on it. But we continue to use these tests as part of the assessment process because whatever it is these tests are measuring, they have been proven to be highly correlated to school performance. So they do predict school success, not for everyone, but for a vast majority of individuals. High scores on IQ tests are correlated to high scores on academic performance tests. Today, IQ testing is pretty closely monitored. We're very careful about how we use it and who we use it with. And they're very carefully interpreted as well. By that I mean we don't look anymore at an IQ score as being indicative of what a person's potential is. We look at it as a place to start. Because I think the current belief is that intelligence that we can measure is something that we can also change with the right types of interventions. In other words, we can make people smarter on IQ tests, and if they do better on IQ tests, it's related to them doing better in school as well. So it's something to try to improve on, and therefore it can be useful as a place to begin. And I have to say also, finally, it's useful for examining differences in how students process information. So I'm not going to go back to that slide, but let me just refer back to, excuse me, I dropped my paper. Let me refer back to the CHC theory. And the CHC theory, if you remember, broke that G factor down into 7 separate factors, broad factors representing some forms of what we consider to be related to items that we consider to be related to intelligence. So think about long-term retrieval, visual processing, auditory processing. As teachers of students with learning disabilities, mild to moderate disabilities in academics, we are particularly concerned with how students best approach learning and what are their deficits in terms of those approaches. So some students we know, or we believe these days, that it's important to think about whether a student can successfully process information auditorily or whether they are more of a visual kind of a learner, for example. We're concerned with all kinds of learners. And so how you take in information as measured by how you perform on these intelligence tests can be useful for us in terms of interventions that we develop for individual students. So if we can see differences on these tests in how and use them as information about strengths and weaknesses that students have, then that's very useful for us as teachers. So I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. I think the bathwater is that useful information that, or Well, the bathwater is the baby. I don't know. Anyway, the useful information, we don't want to get rid of that. We want to keep the useful information and use it as a mechanism for addressing how best to help students learn, what we need to help them compensate for, and what approaches will help them learn what they need to learn in school in the best kinds of ways. So if we just discount the bathwater of the IQ score, and we keep the baby, which is the information that that the subparts of those scores yield to us, then IQ tests continue to be useful, I think. So how do we use IQ tests appropriately? Well, the first thing is that we have to think about we have to use tests in a context that emphasizes prevention and early intervention rather than eligibility determinations. And what does that mean? IQ testing is only appropriate in an environment in which we are first looking at what can we do to help a student learn, and how do we prevent learning problems from happening. So it's kind of that RTI, or tiered intervention context, that you've learned about. If we have a tiered intervention context that looks at children as they begin to struggle and tries to provide appropriate intervention services for them early on without putting a label on them, without caring whether or not they're eligible for something like special education, then we can begin to think about using IQ tests. In a prevention environment, in an early intervention environment, we're not going to do IQ tests first and place a child. We're going to do intervention first. And if the child has to prove that intervention isn't helping, they have to fail to respond to our interventions before we get into looking at standardized testing, including IQ testing, as a way of determining their eligibility and what they're eligible for in terms of special education services. IQ tests should only be used when the results are relevant to well-defined referral questions. So if the referral question is, how smart is Johnny? That's not a good use of IQ tests. Is Johnny smart enough to be in a learning disability classroom, or should Johnny go to a classroom for children who have cognitive impairments? That should not be a use of IQ tests either. That's not a relevant, meaningful question. A well-defined referral question is, does Johnny need help with his auditory processing skills? Is Johnny's approach to reading better done through a phonemic approach or a more visual kind of approach? IQ tests, the way they are designed today, can help us make some of those determinations. Is Johnny experiencing memory problems, which are executive function problems? Is that something that we can be helping him with? That's a well-defined referral question that an IQ test can be useful for. But if, again, we're looking for a score that limits, it's not a good idea. IQ testing also must be part of a multifactored approach that's individualized to the child. So multifactored being multiple tests, multiple people involved in doing it, multiple means of information that we gather together to help us look at the whole picture of a child to determine why Johnny might be having a problem in a given area of learning, and more importantly, what can we do about it? So IQ tests alone aren't going to do that, but they can be part of that process to inform us. And then interpretation of performance should reflect consideration of the overall strengths and weaknesses of a child and performance on other relevant dimensions of age, behavior, family characteristics, and cultural backgrounds. So basically, it's okay to use it as part of a total assessment process as long as we're asking the right questions and we're looking at it carefully and interpreting it carefully. We can't take for granted that a low score means something about a child. We have to look for what the origins of that score are and what we can do about it given the right types of educational interventions. So that leads us to adaptive behavior, and why adaptive behavior and intelligence testing go hand in hand is because in California especially, we have looked at measurement of adaptive behavior as a way around our inability to use IQ tests to measure students' abilities. So when we, for example, sent the African American children back into the general ed classroom, one of the measures that we started to examine as an alternative to IQ testing was the adaptive behavior scales that existed at the time. And the reason for this is that back in the 70s, a woman named Jane Mercer, who was a professor at the University of Riverside, was doing research in the schools, and she coined a term called the 6-hour retardate. These were children, pretty much those African American children that had been placed in classes for EMRs, for EMR students on the basis of these IQ tests. And Jane followed them at home as well as at school. And what she saw was that they were only considered to be cognitively impaired in school. That as members of their community, as members of their families, they were not seen as having any disability whatsoever. They functioned in the real world very well. So the idea emerged that adaptive behavior might be a better way to take a look at these individuals, because if their adaptive behavior skills were high, that would suggest that their performance on intelligence tests were affected more by bias than by actual ability or aptitude. So what is adaptive behavior? It's appropriate response to the demands of the immediate environment. I kind of think the simple word for it is street smarts. And so, and as we all know, you can have intelligence and not street smarts, and I guess vice versa. But street smarts tend to be reflective of some kind of innate ability or learned ability, if we want to think about intelligence as a learned behavior. So adaptive behavior takes into account the demands of a person's physical surroundings as well as their culture and experience. So we're looking to interpret a student's performance on adaptive behavior measures within the context of their actual home and community environment and what the expectations are within that environment. Adaptive behavior, I think I mentioned before, varies with age. It's a measure of performance, what you actually can do today, rather than ability, what we think a score is a measure of your potential for, which is what an IQ test is all about. And it must be considered when a person is being evaluated for cognitive impairment. Back when Larry P. and some of those other court cases that I talked about were happening, the American Association for Mental Retardation changed its definition of what was a person with mental retardation, or a person that we would now today call cognitively impaired. They altered their definition to include poor academic performance, low performance on measures of IQ or intelligence, and low performance on measures of adaptive behavior. That those three things must be in place before we can consider a person to be cognitively impaired. So if you're doing poorly in school and your tested intellectual ability is also low, and when we talked about bias, when we talked about English language learners, we talked about why a student's performance might be depressed on those kinds of tests when they are from an impoverished background, or if they're English language learners. They're not going to do well on intelligence tests. They're not going to do well on academic tests. Both of scores can be low on both of those kinds of tests. But that is not enough to help to make us consider you as cognitively impaired. You must also score poorly on adaptive behavior measures. And that goes again back to those 6-hour retardates that Jane Mercer talked about. These kids were not cognitively impaired. They were affected by bias in intelligence tests. So the new definition of what is cognitive impairment takes into account that tests are biased and that they alone cannot be the determinant of whether a person is considered cognitively impaired or not. We must see that impairment taking place in how they function in their community and in the real world. Adaptive behaviors are typically sampled in these categories. We look at your ability to communicate. We look at your daily living skills. We look at your social skills and relationships. We look at your physical activity and motor skills. And some tests look at maladaptive behavior. In other words, behavior kinds of problems that you may be exhibiting. So let's go through these a little bit. Communication skills are not just how well you speak. They include how well you can get your wants and needs taken care of, even if your ability to verbalize is limited. So there are numbers of individuals, for example, who use augmentative communication devices, who can communicate effectively through signs, who can communicate effectively through gestures and facial expressions and other physical and written means, but who maybe are not testing high on traditional measures of language development. So we look at more the pragmatics of communication, how well you communicate with others and get your wants and needs taken care of. How well can you use the written language that's out in the community to navigate around, those kinds of things. Then we look at daily living skills, things like toileting, keeping yourself clean, brushing your teeth, using the bathroom, things like that, that are cooking for yourself, reading a recipe, grocery shopping, all of those kinds of skills that you need to do in order to survive in the world. Then we look at social skills and relationships, your ability to get along with others. Those are social skills and relationships are important skills in terms of survival in the world because it's hard to survive alone. And so those people who are better at developing relationships with others also find ways to pool abilities in such a way that their functioning in the world is enhanced. And it's an example from a UCLA research project that was done when we first began to deinstitutionalize people from institutions for those who were considered cognitively impaired. There was an anthropologist who followed some of the people who had been released from the institution. And what he found was that if individuals could combine strengths in particularly communication, daily living skills, and social skills, they were able to function much better in the community despite very low measured levels of intelligence than individuals who did not make connections to other people. So, for example, there was one group of 3 people that he talked about where one was very social, very engaging, liked to go out, do things in the community and so forth. One was very good at the daily living skills of taking care of the house, cooking, making sure clothes were clean, things like that. And a third one could drive. And between the 3 of them, They got out, they socialized, they had a clean home, they were able to take care of their basic needs, and they functioned very well despite the fact that they had been considered to be severely and profoundly retarded. So one could say that in terms of adaptive behavior, their skills were very high, and perhaps they didn't deserve that label after all. And then physical activities and motor skills, which all obviously affect your ability to get around, and maladaptive behavior being included because if you have social behavioral problems that impact your ability to relate to others, then you are also going to have a difficult time functioning in the world. So some of the tests look at that. What are the issues in assessing adaptive behavior? Well, there's several. The most commonly used test of adaptive behavior is the Vineland. And as a teacher, you will probably be asked to fill out the teacher rating scale of the Vineland for your students, particularly as they're facing a triennial, like a reevaluation IEP. That's very often used because if we can't use an IQ test, we have to have some way of getting at a student's potential abilities, what their innate, if you will, abilities are. So you'll see the Vineland probably. Now the Vineland has some issues in terms of who is the responder and how the assessment is given. So a Vineland is not a test that is given to the student themselves. It's not a paper and pencil task that the student is asked to fill out. It's not even something that the student is involved with in any way. It's something that someone else fills out about the student. So it could be the teacher filling it out, or it could be the parent being a participant in this assessment of adaptive behavior. Typically, if it's the parent is not asked to fill out a rating scale, like does my child do this, yes or no. The parent is typically interviewed about their child. So someone, usually the school psychologist, but occasionally the teacher, would be asking questions from the Vineland. And these questions are not designed to be asked directly, like, does your child eat with a fork and knife, for example. They're just because the respondent, particularly if the respondent is a parent, is likely to see that question in a couple of different ways. One is they'll see it as something their child should do if you're asking them about it, and that may affect how they answer you. And in thinking that it's something that their child should do, if their child doesn't do it, they may feel like they have to go and teach their child how to do it. So we have to be very careful when we're using an adaptive behavior scale with a parent or caregiver by asking questions in more open-ended ways. Tell me what your child is like at the dinner table. You know, do they help set the table? Do you have to help them with eating in any way? What's their preferred utensil? Are there any modifications to that? Things like that get parents talking about how their child eats as opposed to directly saying yes or no to a close-ended question. So the format for the Vineland is very often an interview. Or in the case of a teacher, the format is usually a rating scale that the teacher fills out with a list of questions. Does this child do this? And it's usually rated on a scale of 0 to 2. 0 being the child doesn't do it at all. 1 being that the behavior is beginning to emerge, and 2 being that the behavior is always present. So back to the parent, the interviewer is also filling out the same kind of scale, but they're doing it based on the parent's answers. They're not saying rate your child on a scale of 0 to 2. They're getting the information from the parent, and they are giving the 1 or the 2 or the 0 as they fill out their protocol. which brings me to typical behavior versus ability to behave. Most adaptive behavior scales, and the Vineland is a good example, do have that scale of 0 to 2 because it tries to distinguish between the behavior not existing at all versus the behavior existing and the level at which that behavior exists. So for example, if going back to eating with a fork, if I asked you as a teacher to say, does this child eat with a fork? You might think, well, yes, they do. I've been working on this with my preschooler, and he's beginning to do that. So your outright answer might be yes, but the scale attempts to differentiate between behaviors that are typically done all the time versus the ability to do a given behavior. So how firmly does that person have that behavior? It also one of the issues in terms of assessing adaptive behavior is how appropriate the items are developmentally. So for some students, there will be items that they don't have anymore because they shouldn't have them. I'll give you an example with communication. There might be a question on the Vineland that is geared towards very young children because it's used from infants up through adulthood, that might be related to whether the child babbles or not. Well, that's okay if the child is 6 months to a year old. You would want that. That's evidence of emerging language development. But if they're 12, you don't want to be asking that question because hopefully the answer is no. So there has to be some thought about whether the question that is being asked is developmentally appropriate for a child or not, and also contextually important. Because I remember being asked when my own stepson was being assessed for possible placement into a classroom for children with learning disabilities. I was interviewed by the school psychologist using the Vineland. And one of the questions was, does your child go to the store independently? Now, at that time, my stepson was going into high school, so of course, developmentally, certainly the answer was yes. But that happens to be a question that is at about a 5-year-old level on that scale. And I thought about it later on because my oldest child was raised in Vermont, and as a 4 or 5-year-old, that question would have been both developmentally appropriate and contextually appropriate because we lived in a community where everyone knew everybody else, and the store was 2 houses down from the house we lived in. And as a 5-year-old, I could send him to the store with $1, and he could come back with a pint of milk. The storekeeper knew him. I mean, it was an appropriate skill for him to have, and it was also a much safer time. We weren't worried about kidnapping and that kind of thing. But raising my other children in California, in Los Angeles, where there wasn't a store down the street, and it's a much more, if you will, dangerous environment for children, and storekeepers aren't likely to know who you are, I would never have been able to answer that question yes. It might have been developmentally appropriate, but it wasn't contextually appropriate for where we live. So there's some issues with whether items are appropriate at a particular age for particular children, depending upon where they live and depending upon the nature of their disability as well. And culture becomes very important as an issue in terms of assessing adaptive behavior and putting an age level on it. Because in various cultures, expectations for children in terms of self-help skills, especially, will vary by age. So one culture may expect their 2-year-old to be using a cup completely and be off the bottle, and in another culture might find it acceptable for their 5-year-old to still be using a bottle. And thus it's hard to have items on an adaptive behavior scale that are culture free themselves. So there's even bias in these tests. And then there's an issue of who is the normative population. So this is something you have to look at when you decide to use an adaptive behavior scale or not. Some scales have been developed for use by special populations only. In other words, some adaptive behavior scales have been developed to be used only by institutions or only by people who work with individuals who have been identified as having a significant cognitive impairment, because they're looking at specific skills that someone needs to have in order to function in the real world. But those are expected at much higher ages for students with cognitive impairments, whereas other adaptive behavior scales will have normative tables for both special populations, children who may have disabilities of one kind or another, and the so-called normal populations, children without disabilities. So you need to look at those kinds of things carefully so you know who you're comparing your student to. Now, that's something important in every test, but adaptive behavior scales are one of the few that can be normed for certain special populations. So you really have to watch out for that. So that kind of concludes my discussion of IQ assessment and adaptive behavior assessment. What I've put on Moodle for you to look at are, first of all, a couple of videos that I think are pretty interesting and a lot more dynamic than what I can do actually on a video, that get into this in a little bit more detail, give you some more background and history, and allow you to see some of the ways that intelligence testing in particular have been utilized to both good and bad ends. So a little bit closer look at some of the controversies associated with IQ assessment, as well as a look at the bias that's inherent in them. So if you only look at one, look at the first one, save the bias one for your free time. We've already talked about bias a lot, but I thought it was a nice summative way to put that information in perspective in terms of intelligence testing. And I've also taken a 6-minute clip from someone's YouTube video where they were demonstrating one of the commonly used tests, which is the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, the WISC, very commonly used. I took a 6-minute excerpt out of it. There's nobody that she's assessing, but she is showing us certain parts of the test. So if you want to take a look at how we measure intelligence, what are some of the test subscales that are used, you'll get a chance to see things like, remember I talked about the blocks and assembling blocks and patterns and things like that. You get a chance to see what some of that looks like, and you'll get a chance to also hear what some of the verbal questions are on an IQ test, because there are verbal measures of IQ as well as nonverbal measures of IQ to control for language. And so you can ask yourself whether you think that even the nonverbal measures are affected by how much you've learned and what you've been exposed to, as much as the language measures may be. So just if you want to take a look at what an IQ test looks like, that little clip will show you something about it. So enjoy those, and don't forget to do your topical assignment for the week. Bye.